There is a great deal to admire and much to learn about cultures different to our own. But what happens when appreciation becomes appropriation, stealing? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. It has been said many times that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Cultures borrowing from one another, music, clothing, food, hairstyles, art, the list goes on. But in some situations it is said cultural appropriation is seen as trivialising, undermining perhaps a culture, stripping it of its meaning and its importance. It is the act of adopting another culture. The use of black music and dance, Native American fashions, or Asian art and dress. They're all frequently seen in Western culture. Cultural appropriation has been labelled by some as theft, ignorant, and even racist.
You're saying that I can't have a hairstyle because of your culture? Why?
But is culture simply the result of the world's collective history? And is it acceptable to use another culture's identity as your own?
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at
The world knows Elvis Presley as the king of rock and roll, but some believe the label has robbed the African American community of the recognition it deserves for creating that genre.
Well, I'm from the country, baby. Get flowed into your bread big town.
Some argue that appreciating someone else's culture becomes appropriation when the exchange is not credited, or when it isn't earned or understood. The sacred Native American war bonnet has been banned from several US music festivals.
I'm pretty sure if Indigenous Americans had been given back a good portion of their land, were living equally to other citizens of America, they'd just be a little bit like, that's a bit tacky, it's a bit naff. But the resentment comes from the reality of how they live.
But what is wrong with celebrating cultures that are different to your own?
You know, a person from Australia wearing a Nigerian outfit, it's not cultural appropriation, that's just them wearing a Nigerian outfit. What would be cultural appropriation is if they colonized Nigeria, took all Nigeria's stuff, and then said, it's not Nigerian, it's mine. And I think it's understanding that colonial relationship is the only way to really understand the root cause of that resentment and that history.
Hundreds of ethnicities make up the character of the world's major global cities. Within them, diverse communities often adopt the customs and traditions of the cultural groups that surround them. Cultural borrowing is evident in language, religion, agriculture, and food. These issues raise important and complex questions about the nature of culture. Can different communities learn to coexist in environments that are creatively and culturally open? Or is cultural appropriation robbing minority groups of the credit they deserve? Well, do people sometimes take borrowing from another culture too far, or should it be seen as an appreciation of that other culture? We're going to talk about that now at the round table. I'm joined by Maya Goodfellow from the School of Oriental and African Studies. She believes that using elements of other cultures isn't always a bad thing. It's the way it's presented that's important. Next to her, Dr. Kahindi Andrews, who says the problem is when an element of a minority culture is used out of context and exploited. Naomi First is a writer. She says that cultural appropriation makes the world a better place. And also at the table, pleased to welcome broadcaster and writer Priscilla who says it creates divisions and more inequality. Lots to talk about. Let's begin with you, Dr. Andrews. Give me an example, if you can, where cultural appropriation has happened and where it's been a bad thing.
Well, I think the key thing for this discussion is about exploiting the culture and it's about misusing it. So there's a chain of restaurants that I won't name, but they use Jamaican imagery and they use Jamaican music and it's badly cooked Jamaican food. And they actually have an app online where you can rastify yourself, which has dreadlocks over you and it darkens your skin. Not only is that blatantly blackface and offensive, but that's the perfect example, taking a culture that isn't yours, misusing it, misrepresenting it,
But if that's the best example
gain.
you can find, it doesn't seem to be a very big problem. Anybody want to comment
That's not
on
a problem. That's okay. People find a rastify
it's
app
not a big
blackface.
problem, but if that's the best example you can
I
find.
think it's one example that shows actually there's an economic element to it, an exploitation element to it as well. People making money off the culture. That's really important. And abusing the culture. And then blackface actually is quite a big issue. I mean, blackface is quite an offensive
But then is there something wrong with, I don't know, a British person opening an Italian restaurant? I mean, I'm British, I cook pasta. Is that appropriation? Is that a problem? You know, I think when you start pinpointing all these tiny little things, you're making something a little bit ridiculous. I mean, we've seen recently things like women like Kendall Jenner being criticised for wearing cornrows. We're talking about a hairstyle. I mean, who really cares about how she does her hair?
So I mean, I think this whole debate actually needs to be put in a much broader context. These individuals, I'm less bothered about. Always boiling it down to identity, I also think is less helpful. I think we need to see this as in terms of modes of power working. So we need to talk about, as Kehinde said, the exploitation element that goes on. And I think this operates in two ways. So we see this kind of in terms of the global economy. So we see certain clothing brands using images from different traditions, from marginalised groups of people, totally erasing them, but importantly as well within that, what we need to connect that up with is the exploitation that occurs in the global south. So the people who are making those clothes in the first place are the people who are often erased from our broader conversation.
But is it not perhaps a problem that people go looking for rather than one that is there and needs to be dealt with?
No, because as I've just said, I think this is actually a way in to talk about more broader forms of exploitation. I'm not interested in just talking about cultural appropriation as, you know, whether people borrowing from one of those cultures. I wanted to see it as a global web of power.
Priscilla wanted to say something.
Yeah, you know, you said something about taking clothing from other cultures and totally erasing them. How was the culture erased or the taking of the clothing erased?
So I think it's when we see, in terms of like ads, for instance, if we see big clothing brands using a symbol from a certain tradition from one part of the world, for instance, and then those people aren't represented at all. And the way that's, I think what's more important actually is the way that's then used to make profit, and the people who are being exploited
Isn't
in
it
that
fair
process
to say
are the
that?
marginalised.
I mean, let's say, for instance, most of us around the world, we wear suits. But when we go around the world, we wear suits to the boardroom, to the office, and to whatever it is that we do. But if you go around the world, you will find that most of those cultures, their traditional wears are not suits. So then it's okay for us to wear suits. We're not then, at that point, as you say, erasing that culture or misappropriating it or misusing it. It is fine and it's accepted, right? However, in all of these different cultures around the world, everybody has their traditional way of dressing, even here in Britain, in Scotland.
But I suppose the point I'm trying to make, well, we'll get on to Scotland in just a minute because I've got a bit of history there. The point I'm trying to make is that if you go looking for a problem, then you can find a problem. And what we're finding perhaps here is that this is political correctness gone bonkers.
What even is political correctness gone bonkers? What it is, and this is typically from the majority culture will tell you, you're just looking for problems, you're just finding problems. Actually, no. Blackface is a problem, right? Actually, economically, if I can't open a restaurant because all this big chain of Jamaican faux restaurants is open, that is a problem. Actually, especially in a situation where, because of racism, it's far more unlikely for Caribbean people of descent to get jobs, right? So when you're squeezed out of a market as well. So there's an economic aspect to this. It might not seem like a big problem to you, but it actually is a very, very, very big problem. And people aren't looking for them. They
But I think those are
them.
separate issues, though, is it not? I think the issue, the economic factor, where, for instance, big chains are, you know, drowning out the little businessman. I think that's an economic issue, and it's not necessarily a cultural issue per se. You made mention earlier about, you know, a chain of restaurants, and I was wondering, is it the same chain of restaurants that maybe has a black person as its originator, for instance, that now, you know, goes on to have
let's leave this one particular example to one side, and let me ask you, each one of you, to say or ponder, how can a culture develop without borrowing from other cultures?
No, but it's not borrowing, it's stealing, and it's about misuse. There's no
Okay,
problem
without
there.
influences from other cultures, how can we all change?
I mean, I think, I think this does come back to we need to put power into this, and we need to look at actually global forms of exploitation. So I'm not particularly bothered about people taking from one another's traditions and sharing in that way. But I think what's problematic, if we go back to the 80s, for instance, in the UK, we saw a push towards multiculturalism, but there was a kind of critique of that talked about saris, samosas, and steel bands. And what that was that people within the UK political scene were saying, oh, well, you know, we're adopting these parts of people's culture, but they weren't dealing with systemic racism. So my concern is less about this borrowing and more about what does it hide in terms of power.
So that was stereotyping. But I think it's fair to say that in a world that we're in today, where, you know, we all have access to information at the tip of our fingers, isn't it fair to say that we're all highly influenced easily influenced by other people's culture, because we're more open to it now, we're more susceptible to it, we're more likely to hear about it, to see it, and to learn about it.
No, but it's
So
natural
would that not influence us?
I think that it makes the world a better, more interesting place.
Yeah, well, I don't see how you can possibly develop culture without being influenced by others. And I think, you know, when you look at the artistic world, when you look at music, when you look at literature, when you look at art, artists are constantly influenced by other people's cultures. And it's a beautiful thing. You end up with beautiful pieces of work. And if you take music's a really good example, classical composers are constantly borrowing from other countries, from other cultures. I mean, if you look at the Italian composer Puccini, he wrote the famous Madame Butterfly. That's about Japanese geishas. You know, do we have to now stop listening to it? Is it offensive? Has he appropriated culture? This is what this discussion starts doing. It starts saying that you cannot enjoy other people's culture.
You could turn around to me and say, no, you can't talk about that because it is cultural appropriation. I have no idea whether it is or it isn't. This is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, because you're talking about a bigger problem underneath rather than those.
But that's why I think we need to be really specific in what we're talking about, and that's why I keep bringing it back to power. And that issue about stereotyping, it wasn't just stereotyping, it was actually the British state saying, look, we're progressive and we've moved on and we're accepting people into our country, but actually they weren't dealing with systemic racism. So what I am much more interested in talking about is how these certain symbols are used to kind of give a progressive air, when actually underneath the surface there's all forms of discrimination and oppression still going on. So I don't have an issue with people borrowing and exchanging.
Maya, one thing you said is a history of the global north, in other words, the rich world, going round the world and adopting cultures and exploiting them. So in what sense is there exploitation?
But I mean, it depends what we're talking about.
Well, you said it, so you tell me what you're talking about.
So I think historically what we have seen in colonialism, we did see people from the global north, particularly from the UK, going around the world and using different parts of people's different parts in terms of resource extraction, taking that and making money.
But that isn't cultural exploitation.
Sure, but that's what I was talking about.
But that's a separate issue. When we talk about cultural appropriation, it always comes down to really superficial things like hairstyles, like symbols in like a fashion designer, you know, making a collection based on maybe perhaps Indian culture when the designer themselves isn't Indian. We're talking about, for me, this is cultural exchange. This is actually a really positive thing. It's part of living in the society that we live in today, where you do have so much
It's multicultural,
interchange.
isn't it? You know, I mean, look at London here, for instance. Every step you take in London, you will meet somebody of a different ethnic group, of a different culture, and that will certainly have influence.
I'll ask you something in just a moment, if I may. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you talk about sort of the white dreads being one of the examples, right? But what about somebody with black skin who has straight hair?
What about me, for instance, who has a weave on, for instance? I mean, am I then abusing the Caucasian female's type of hairstyle? What am I doing?
No,
am I celebrating it? Am I appreciating it? Am I saying, what am I saying?
There's power and there's intent in both these discussions. And actually, one of the things we lack with cultural appropriation is also the cultural control that the West has over places. So the reason that straight hair or the reason we wear suits around the world, that actually isn't just because of cultural domination. And the flip side of that is cultural appropriation. So for example, dreadlocks, and you say it's not a big issue, actually hair is a huge huge issue. People are arrested on the streets in the 70s, my family, because of dreadlocks. Dreadlocks are a political statement tied to the Rastafarian movement. They're not just a hairstyle. So
But isn't that born out of stereotype?
What if a white person's a Rastafarian and they believe in the Rastafarian
And
religion?
there are people who are, I know white dreads, and 100%, and no one's criticising them. But when
White Rastas I know of, white Rastas who were pulled over because it was believed the marijuana culture of the Rastafarians.
The point I'm making is a
made it
difference, though,
necessary.
when a pop star like Justin Bieber, who has no connection to it and just does it to be cool, and that's a different thing.
But
That's
isn't
a
that a form of
that's a
flattery?
cultural
But hold
no,
on,
that's
hold
a
on,
form of
hold
abuse.
on.
That's a
Isn't-
form of
isn't
exploiting
that
it to
Not a
look.
form of abuse. That's
Isn't it a
ridiculous.
case?
It is.
No, I don't agree that it's a form of abuse. I do think, though, that the situations you mentioned there about the 70s, I think those situations were born out of stereotype and racism. I don't think necessarily that they were cultural. It was because of the abuse of cultural appropriation.
No, what I'm
instance.
trying to say is that you can't just taking dreads and saying, well, I'm just putting these in my hair, or even Kane Rose saying it, same kind of politics behind
Well,
that.
no,
And
I
saying
think-
it's what a writer calls you have to deal with everything but the burden. For you, it's
But
fine. Put
is
it on, yeah, it's
okay,
just a laugh. Actually, for us, this is real serious.
So then, if
Still
Justin
today.
Bieber wears it, for instance, is it not fair then to say that, could that not persuade and to help others understand that wearing dreadlocks doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, or that it's not a negative thing? Are we not more likely to be,
Depends on your view of Justin Bieber.
well, this is it. And again,
You have Whoopi Goldberg saying it works both ways.
It doesn't work both ways.
Well, I mean, she's a black icon, isn't she? I mean, and she says
absolutely.
it does.
No, because it's about power. It's about what does that mean, manipulation. And I don't have the power to if I go around in whiteface tomorrow, it's not going to.
I think there are layers to this, and I think one of the dangers with this conversation is that there are different areas to it, and we can often mix the issues up. I think that it can be difficult to divide and to be clear on what exactly cultural appropriation is, as opposed to what stereotyping is, what racism is, and you speak about power and domination. When you go to Africa, for instance, the dominant group there are Africans, and yes, they are.
Unfortunately, that's actually not true. The dominant group and the dominant culture is still European. That's why you wear suits. That's why you have this culture.
No, it's not.
100%.
But then the question here is this. Well, I don't know. From your name, I can tell that you're probably from the West African region. But I'm also from there. When I'm in Africa, I see my fellow Africans dressed in their.
Well, and I have to say, I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and I have not seen white culture dominating. I've been West Africa, North Africa, South Africa, East Africa, Western Sahara.
One of the biggest problems on the African continent is skin bleaching. People are bleaching their
It's
skin
not
to
one
be
of the
white.
biggest problems.
It is. It's a huge problem.
100 one of the biggest problems on the African
There's
continent.
other problems as well, but it's certainly a problem.
That's fashion, isn't it? That's pressure. That's peer pressure. That's
be what?
But then we have
you this.
here everybody going under the sunbed.
Let me
I'll
throw
rest
this one
there.
out. Why? I know we invited you here today to talk about this, but why has it become a hot topic? It's not just because we suddenly noticed it, Naomi. Why are people talking about it now?
I think it's really part of identity politics, and it's this obsession with constantly putting people into very specific boxes. With the debate around culture appropriation, I find it's this bizarre desire, I find it an odd desire to put people into their boxes of cultural heritage, like black, white, Asian, straight, gay, and to say you only have the right to use the culture or enjoy the culture of the background that you come from. And the problem I have with it is I think it's actually extremely divisive. And whilst they'll talk about we need to have this debate about cultural appropriation because, to try and build bridges and deal with problems of racism, I actually think it encourages a racialized way of thinking and ignores, universal human values that we have and that are intrinsic in culture. And that's why you see it so much in art, in music and literature, that you see cultures borrowing from each other because we have these universal values. And isn't that something?
What?
So I kind of want to bring it back again. I don't have an issue with this sharing of traditions or whatever, but I think that it needs to actually be flipped round. And what certain people are doing with this debate, not everyone. I think sometimes this debate takes on a life of its own in an unhelpful way. But what certain people are doing with this debate is shining a light on how these things are already racialized. To say that it re-entrenches that racialization misunderstands the way power is working. Because what happens is if an Indian woman walks down the street in a sari, she may be accused of not integrating integrating into UK society. If a white woman does it, there's a chance that she may be seen as embracing multiculturalism. So what I'm not saying that that woman shouldn't be allowed to wear the sari. What I'm saying is we need to use the debate to look at actually the forms of racialization that are already occurring.
But let me
and to say
ask,
that it always reinforces them really misunderstands how modes of power are.
let me
operating
ask,
there.
if an Indian woman is wearing sari and walking down the street in India, would that be seen as an issue?
No, of course not.
Right. So then, why then, if it's here in the United Kingdom, naturally, because this is a different country. So if an Indian woman is seen wearing sari walking down the street, there is a chance, a possibility that somebody is going to think, well, they're not integrating as much. But I do find that a lot of Asian women continue wearing their saris, which I think they look beautiful in, and it looks great. And it just continues to say, yes, we live in a multicultural society. I think that that only becomes an issue depending on where the person is at. And I do
So
think
it's time and place, is it?
it's time and place, because back in India, it's not an issue. Nobody's going to question it.
Also in India, it's not an issue to walk around in a suit or to walk around in jeans and Western clothes, right? And this is where power comes in.
Yeah.
It's an issue here because of the racialized framework that we live in here. And to
how-
say there's
Who
no
makes it an
racialized framework
issue?
is a problem.
But
Who
how
makes
does
it-
telling
It's not
someone
the
they
Indian woman
can't
in the
wear a
sari.
sari help the how does
But I'm
telling
not
a white
saying
woman
that she
she
should.
couldn't
What
wear
I'm
a
saying is
sari?
this. I'm not saying I'm not saying they should. What I'm saying is we should look at the different forms of power that are operating
Okay, and
in order to understand this whole
let's try
debate.
now to see how far this is going to go. We were talking beforehand about a rugby club, Exeter Chiefs, top rugby club in England last season, came top of the championship. They are called the Exeter Chiefs, and there is a historian called Rachel Herman, who wants them to change their name because she says they've stolen it from the Native American culture. Too far? Going too far?
We have chiefs in Africa, so have they stolen it from there as well?
Oh, except they wear the Native American headdress. Not the players, of course, but the fans.
I think it's one of those debates where, like, this is when you use a debate like this to say, well, let's pick out this example and this example and this example. That's not the worst way to use a debate. I think there just needs to be a general acceptance that, you know, cultures have histories and they have, and to use them out of context to exploit them, to make money off them, to misrepresent them is a bad thing. I think that's where we should be.
Okay.
I mean,
You didn't answer my question, Maya.
But
Would you
to
answer
be
my
honest,
question? Do you
I
think
mean-
that's going too far?
No, not necessarily. No, but what I'm more interested in talking about is actually the racialization that leads to that point. So yeah, we can change names, we can ban certain things, but actually I would much rather talk about systemic racism. And I think that we should have a discussion about how we can unpick that, and that does include.
Yeah, okay. I'm going
trivialising,
to come back to you in a
but-
second because I'm going to go to these two on this side of the table and ask if there is any kind of solution that they see coming, or if they really believe there really isn't a problem. Then we'll come back to you to wrap up the programme with that. Is there a problem here, or is it just perception?
I don't think there's a problem. I'm not denying that there, exist in the world issues with racism and equality. I don't think this cultural appropriation debate has anything to do with that, and I don't think it's helpful to look at people in this extremely divisive way. I would much, I don't know, for me, especially when you're talking about culture, that is something where you can really celebrate universal values, and someone wearing a white woman wearing a sari, to me that is a form of flattery, and all that can do is kind of help build bridges, help reduce prejudice.
See, the suggestion is, I think, that some people, not necessarily these two to my right, but some people are using this as a means to get at a bigger argument, and that therefore there actually is not necessarily a problem per se with cultural appropriation. It is a different argument altogether.
I absolutely agree. I think that, they're looking at it from the prism of racism and stereotyping. And rather than looking at it from, the angle of saying this is a good thing, and saying that, like you rightly said, it can only enhance and it can only build bridges. It can only help us to understand each other better, and it can only help us.
And if we understand each other better, if we understand each other better, that's a great thing.
But this is not what cultural appropriation does, and I think that's what's missing the point here, is that when you culturally appropriate, you don't get a good understanding of the culture, so it doesn't make that. Hip-hop's a perfect example,
When
right?
you say you
Hip-hop
don't
is
get
I'll give you a good
example
example. Hip-hop is a
of
perfect
the
example,
culture.
right? So what happens in hip-hop is it gets culturally appropriated. The bits that are cool get picked out. So the way to dress and the thug and this image and that image, and that's what you see now. That's been appropriated. And actually, that's a terrible way to understand hip-hop culture. It's a terrible way to understand black culture. And what it's done is actually
But there are good
produced this.
hip-hop white artists, aren't
Oh
there?
yeah, no, this isn't even a white-black issue. Most of the people I'm talking about are black doing this kind of music. But my point is that when you appropriate and take out just little bits and surface bits and the bits which generally tend to be quite stereotypical, then you end up with a way of engaging in the culture which is negative, which doesn't work.
We should police how people get involved in different cultures.
No, what we should be trying to say is that culture,
what's the
the
solution
idea that you have this kind of underground, syncretic culture developing, great, but actually this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about
Are you
top-down,
suggesting-
culture.
How do we get away from what I sometimes would imagine to be isolationism, in other words, keeping cultures entirely separate, and bringing it through to other cultures in a good way? How does that
I mean, I think this has to occur alongside different forms of dealing with discrimination and systemic modes of power. And this is why I keep bringing it back to power, is if we look at cultural theorists like Stuart Hall, they showed us how this operated. They showed us how different parts of people's cultures were used and then held up as stereotypes, and how that negatively reinforces modes of power that already exist. So it's not about policing people, it's about recognizing that this is part of a web of power globally that hasn't been dealt with properly, and actually often little parts of people's traditions are used to gloss over these different forms of discrimination that occur every single day.
You know,
We haven't got any time. Got no time left. No time left. You're left with your mouth open. And you know, for me, the point is we never got around to talking about cultural appropriation and my Scottishness.
yeah.
But maybe we'll save that for another day. What used to happen was I used to go to see my Scottish cousins and end up talking like a Scotsman, and they thought I sounded ridiculous. I don't know whether that was it or not. Thank you all so very much indeed. We do live in a world where culture and geographical borders are increasingly blurred, and as people and communities come closer together, appreciating and respecting different cultures, I think we've agreed on that is a key to a thriving society. This has been Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the team, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.